The atmospheric processors of Kepler Station never stopped humming, filling the lower corridors with a constant vibration that seemed to seep into your bones. Vex pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the supply depot, watching the morning shift change through the grimy porthole. Her daughter Mika sat beside her, small hands wrapped around a piece of synthetic bread that had gone stale 3 days ago. The bread was their last food. Nira's fingers moved unconsciously to the pendant hanging around her necker, piece of carved jade from her homeworld that had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, then her. It was the only thing of value she had left after fleeing Zephyr Prime when the mining consortium collapsed. Everything else had been sold, traded, or lost during their passage to this remote station at the edge of civilized space. Mama Mika whispered, her voice barely audible over the processor hum. My stomach hurts. Nira pulled her daughter closer, feeling how thin the girl had become. At 8 years old, Mika should have been running through corridors, laughing with other children. Instead, she sat quietly, never complaining, never asking for more than what they had. It broke Nira's heart in ways she couldn't name. The supply depot's main entrance hissed open, and workers began emerging with their daily rations. Nira watched them carefully, noting which ones might be willing to trade, which ones looked away when they saw her. After 3 weeks on the station, she had learned to read faces quickly. A human woman in maintenance coveralls paused near where they sat. Her eyes lingered on Mika for a moment before she reached into her pocket and pulled out a protein bar. Without a word, she set it on the ground between them and walked away. Mika's eyes went wide. Mama, can I wait? Nira said softly. She had learned to be cautious about unexpected kindness. On Zephyr Prime, gifts often came with hidden costs. As she watched the woman disappear into the crowd, she saw no signs of deception, no lingering glances that suggested ulterior motives. She handed the protein bar to Mika, who tore it open with desperate fingers. The girl ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. Watching her daughter eat, Nira made a decision that felt like tearing out part of her soul. Her fingers closed around the jade pendant. The stone was warm from resting against her skin, smooth from generations of handling. She could almost hear her mother's voice. This will protect you, little star. Keep it close, and you'll never be truly alone. But protection meant nothing if Mika starved. Nira stood and walked to the depot's trading window, where a bored-looking clerk was processing. Exchange requests. She placed the pendant on the counter, her hand trembling slightly. What's it worth? She asked. The clerk picked it up, examining it with practiced disinterest. Real jade, nice carving. I can give you enough credits for a week's worth of basic rations. A week. 7 days of keeping Mika fed, of seeing color return to her daughter's cheeks. Nira thought of her grandmother's hand shaping the stone, of her mother's tears when she'd given it away, of the weight it had carried through 3 generations of women who had survived because they made impossible choices. Deal, she whispered, when she returned to Mika with the credit chip and the receipt for their first real meal in days. Her daughter looked up at her with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. You sold grandmother's necklace, Mika said quietly. Nira knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Some things are more valuable than others, little star. You are the most valuable thing in any universe. As they walked toward the food dispensary together, Nira felt lighter and heavier at the same time, lighter without the pendant's familiar weight, heavier with the knowledge that she had nothing left to trade when these credits ran out. But for now, her daughter would eat. Tomorrow's hunger was tomorrow's problem. Tobias Crane had worked the supply depot for 6 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of desperation. He saw it in the way people's shoulders curved inward when they approached his window, in the slight tremor of hands counting credits, in the careful way they examined each item as if weighing its worth against their hunger. But the Zephyrian woman with the silver-streaked hair was different. She never begged, never made excuses, never tried to negotiate for better deals. Simply presented what she had to trade with the dignity that made. Tobias, uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain, he'd watched her sell the jade pendant 3 days ago. The way she'd hesitated before placing it on the counter. The way her daughter had looked at her with those 2 knowing eyes. It stirred something in his chest that he'd spent years trying to keep buried. Tobias wasn't a man who got involved. He processed trades, managed inventory, kept the depot running smoothly. He went home to his small quarters, ate his regulation meals, and tried not to think about the faces that passed through his window each day. Getting attached to the station's refugees was a luxury he couldn't afford. But that morning, as he sorted through a shipment of damaged goods marked for disposal, he found himself thinking about the little girl's hollow cheeks. The shipment contained mostly items with minor flaws, dented food containers, clothing with small tears, blankets with frayed edges. Regulations required him to incinerate anything that couldn't be sold at full value. It was wasteful, but the mining consortium's policies were clear about maintaining quality standards. Tobias stared at a thermal blanket that had a single loose seam, perfectly functional, just not sellable. He thought about the woman and her daughter sleeping in whatever corner they'd found, probably sharing body heat to stay warm in the station's perpetually cold lower levels. Before he could reconsider, he folded the blanket and slipped it into a disposal bag, but instead of heading to the incinerators, he carried it to the maintenance corridor where he'd seen them yesterday. The area was empty now, but he left the bag tucked behind a support beam where it would be hidden from casual observation but visible to someone looking for shelter. The next day, the blanket was gone. Tobias began to develop a routine. He would sort through the damaged goods with more care, finding items that were technically flawed but practically useful. A water recycler with a scratched casing, but perfect function. Nutrition bars past their optimal freshness date, but still safe to eat. Children's clothing that was the wrong size for current inventory, but might fit a small 8-year-old dot. He never saw them take the items, but they always disappeared within a day or two. And when he glimpsed the woman at his trading window, he noticed small changes. Her daughter's coat looked warmer. The girl's face had more color. The woman herself stood a little straighter. Tobias told himself he was just efficiently disposing of waste. The items would have been destroyed anyway. He wasn't breaking regulations, just ... interpreting them creatively. Late at night, alone in his quarters, he admitted the truth to himself. It was helping them because watching that little girl's quiet hunger had reminded him of someone else. Long ago, his sister Anna had been about the same age when their family's mining contract was terminated. He remembered the way she'd tried to hide her empty stomach, the way she'd pretend she wasn't hungry so their parents would eat her share. Anna had died during their evacuation from the failed colony, not from violence or accident, but from the slow wearing down of a body that had gone without adequate nutrition for too long. Tobias had been 17 then, old enough to work but not old enough to change anything. He'd sworn he would never be helpless like that again, would never watch someone waste away when he had the power to help now. 30 years later, he found himself thinking about Anna every time he saw Mika's serious dark eyes. On the 5th day of his new routine, Tobias was leaving a package of protein supplements when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to find the woman watching him from the shadows, her expression unreadable. "You've been leaving things," she said quietly. Tobias straightened, feeling like a child caught stealing cookies. "Waste disposal," he managed. "Damaged goods have to go somewhere." She stepped closer, studying his face in the dim corridor lighting. Why? The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Tobias could have deflected, could have maintained his cover story about waste management. Instead, he found himself saying, "Because your daughter reminds me of someone I couldn't save." The woman's expression softened slightly. "What was her name? Anna?" She nodded once, as if filing the information away. Then she said, "I'm Nira. My daughter is Mika." Tobias. They stood in the maintenance corridor for a moment, two strangers bound by the weight of trying to keep someone small and precious, alive in a universe that seemed designed to grind them down. "Thank you," Nira said finally. Tobias nodded and walked away. But something had shifted between them. Tomorrow, he decided, he wouldn't have to hide the packages quite so carefully. Mika Vex had always been good at noticing things adults thought they were hiding. She noticed when her mother's hands shook from hunger before she ate. She noticed when Mama counted their credits 3 times before buying anything. She noticed when the nice man from the supply depot started leaving packages in their hiding spot, always when he thought no one was watching. She also noticed that her mother was scared of trusting him. He could want something, Nira had whispered one evening, as they shared a meal of real vegetables, the first fresh food they'd had since leaving Zephyr Prime. People don't help for nothing. But Mika had watched Tobias through the depot window. She'd seen how his eyes got sad when children came to trade with their parents. She'd seen him slip extra rations to the old Arcturian man whose hands shook. Too much to work. She'd seen him argue with the depot supervisor about throwing away food that was only 1 day. It's past its optimal date. Tobias wasn't like the consortium officials, who had smiled while they stripped everything from her family. He was like Mama, someone who hurt when other people hurt. The morning everything changed started with alarms. The station's emergency klaxons echoed through the lower levels, followed by the supervisor's voice over the intercom. All residents report to designated safe zones. Incoming solar storm. This is not a drill. Mika had lived through solar storms before. The radiation could fry electronics and overload power grids. But the real danger was the cold that followed when life support systems struggled to compensate. On their last station, she remembered sleeping pressed against Mama while ice formed on the walls of their shelter. The designated safe zone for lower-level residents was Cargo Bay Savina, vast unheated space filled with emergency supplies. In temporary shelters, families clustered together on thermal mats, sharing warmth and worried whispers about how long the storm might last. Mika and her mother found a spot near the wall, as far from the crowds as possible. Nira still didn't trust groups of strangers, and Mika had learned to follow her mother's instincts. They settled onto their thin mat and waited. The temperature began dropping within hours. Emergency power meant minimal heating, and the bay's metal walls seemed to leach warmth from the air. Mika pressed close to her mother, feeling the familiar ache of cold seeping into her bones. That's when she saw Tobias making his way through the shelter, carrying supplies from the depot. He moved efficiently, distributing thermal blankets and nutrition packs to families who needed them most. He didn't ask for payment or gratitude, just handed out supplies like it was his job, which Mika realized it probably was during emergencies. But when he reached their corner, he paused. His eyes met Mika's, then shifted to her mother's pale face. "Extra blankets," he said quietly, setting down a pack that was clearly larger than what others had received. "We can't pay," Nira started. "Emergency allocation," Tobias interrupted. "Everyone gets what they need." He moved on before Nira could protest further, but Mika saw her mother's shoulders relax slightly. She also saw something else. Tobias had left them more than blankets. Hidden beneath the thermal wraps was a small heating unit, the kind used in depot storage areas to keep sensitive equipment warm. As the hours passed and the temperature continued to drop, Mika watched the other families. The lucky ones had multiple adults to share warmth. The unlucky ones, mostly single parents with children, elderly people alone. Injured workers who couldn't generate much body heat began to show signs of hypothermia. Mika made a decision. "Mama," she whispered, tugging on Nira's sleeve. "Look." She pointed to a woman across the bay who was holding twin babies, both crying with the thin, weak sound of infants who were too cold. The woman's lips were blue, and she kept switching the babies from arm to arm as if she couldn't keep them both warm at once. "We have extra," Mika said simply. Nira followed her daughter's gaze, then looked down at the heating unit Tobias had given them. For a moment, Mika thought her mother would say no. They needed the warmth themselves. Sharing meant being cold. Being cold meant being weak. But then, Nira's expression shifted, and Mika saw something familiar in her eyes, the same look she'd had when she'd sold grandmother's pendant. "Go ask if they need help," Nira said softly. Mika scrambled to her feet and walked across the bay, her breath visible in small puffs. The woman with the babies looked up as she approached, wariness flickering across her exhausted features. "My mama has a heater," Mika said. "Now, you could bring your babies over, there's room." The woman stared at her for a long moment, then glanced toward where Nira sat. Slowly, she gathered her children and followed Mika back across the bay. Within an hour, their small space had become a gathering point. Tobias noticed and began quietly directing other vulnerable families in their direction. Soon they had a cluster of 8 people sharing warmth. Nira and Mika, the woman with twins, an elderly Centauri man with a chronic cough, and a teenage boy whose parents had died in a mining accident. As the storm raged outside and the temperature continued to drop, Mika found herself sitting between her mother and Tobias, watching over their improvised family. The heating unit hummed quietly, keeping them all alive. "Thank you," the woman with the babies whispered to Nira. "Thank her," Nira replied, nodding toward Mika. "She's the one who saw you needed help." Tobias looked down at Mika, something like wonder in his eyes. "Smart kid." "She gets that from her father," Nira said, then paused. It was the first time she'd mentioned Mika's father since they'd arrived at the station. "What was he like?" Mika asked. She rarely asked about her father, though. Questions always made her mother sad. "He was someone who believed people should take care of each other," Nira said, glancing at Tobias. "He would have liked what we're doing here." When the storm finally passed and normal power was restored, their temporary family dispersed back to their individual struggles. But something had changed. Mika had seen her mother smile at strangers. She'd seen Tobias laugh at something the elderly Centauri man said. She'd seen what happened when people stopped being afraid of each other long enough to help Dot as they packed their things to return to their hideout in the maintenance corridors. Mika made another decision. "Mama," she said, "I think we should trust him." Nira looked at Tobias, who was helping fold emergency blankets. "Maybe you're right, little star." Warden Hollis had built his career on maintaining order through strict adherence to regulations. In 23 years of station administration, he had learned that flexibility bred chaos, and chaos bred the kind of problems that got administrators reassigned to even less desirable postings than Kepler Station. So when his morning security briefing included a report about irregular supply distribution patterns in the depot, Hollis felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with potential rule violations. "Show me the data," he told Security Chief Ramos, settling behind his desk with a cup of recycled coffee that tasted like metal shavings. Ramos activated the wall display, bringing up shipping manifests and disposal logs. "Crane and Supply has been marking significantly more items as damaged beyond retail sale over the past 2 weeks, but the incineration logs don't match the disposal reports." Hollis studied the numbers, his jaw tightening. "How much of a discrepancy?" "About 30%. That's enough missing inventory to feed a family for several weeks." The implication was clear. Tobias Crane was either stealing supplies for personal use or distributing them without authorization. Either violation was grounds for immediate termination and possible criminal charges. "Bring him in," Hollis ordered. An hour later, Tobias sat across from Hollis's desk, his expression carefully neutral. He'd worked stations long enough to recognize an administrative investigation when he saw one. "Mr. Crane," Hollis began, consulting his tablet, "there are some inconsistencies in your disposal reports that need clarification." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Items marked as damaged but not appearing in incineration logs. Food supplies, clothing, medical supplies. Enough to suggest systematic diversion rather than clerical errors." Tobias met the warden's gaze steadily. "I dispose of waste according to regulations." "Then you won't mind showing me where these items went?" "It wasn't really a request." Hollis stood and walked to the door, expecting Tobias to follow. They made their way through the station's corridors, past the commercial district and into the lower levels where transient workers and refugees made their temporary homes. Hollis had rarely ventured into this area. His duties kept him in the administrative sections, dealing with shipping schedules and corporate reports. But as they descended, began to notice things that his security briefings had never mentioned: the number of children who looked to thin, the way people clustered around heating vents, the makeshift shelters constructed in maintenance alcoves, "This is where you've been bringing the supplies," Hollis said. It wasn't a question. Yes. The simple admission surprised him. Hollis had expected denials, excuses, attempts to minimize the violation. Instead, Tobias had just confirmed theft of station property worth several thousand credits. "Do you understand the position this puts me in?" Hollis asked. "I can't ignore direct violations of consortium policy." "I understand." They stood in the corridor, two men who had spent their careers following different interpretations of duty. Around them, the station hummed, with the sound of people trying to survive in a universe that seemed designed to make survival as difficult as possible. "There's a family," Tobias said quietly. "Woman and her daughter. They've been living on nothing for weeks. The kid reminds me of... He stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what she reminds me of. She was hungry." They were all hungry. Hollis felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. "And you decided to solve that problem by stealing station supplies. Damaged supplies that were going to be destroyed anyway. That's not your decision to make." A small voice interrupted them.
"Hey, Mr. Tobias."
They turned to see Mika approaching, her eyes wide with concern. She looked between the two men, clearly. Sensing tension, Mika Tobias said gently, "You should get back to your mother." "Is something wrong?" she asked. "You look sound." Hollis found himself studying the child more carefully. She was thin, but not emaciated. Her clothes were clean and warm. She moved with the alertness of someone who was adequately fed and cared for. In other words, she looked like what a child should look like, rather than like the hollow-eyed waifs he'd glimpsed in the lower levels. "Everything's fine," Tobias told her. "Go on." After Mika disappeared back into the maze of corridors, Hollis stood in silence for a long moment. He was thinking about his own daughter, safe in a boarding school on Mars, well-fed and warm and surrounded by every advantage his position could provide. "How many people have you been feeding?" he asked finally. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters. Because if I report this, I need to know the full scope." Tobias considered the question. "Maybe a dozen families. Maybe more." "I stopped counting after the first week." The numbers were worse than Hollis had imagined. This wasn't a small-scale charity operation, it was systematic redistribution of station resources. The kind of violation that could result in criminal prosecution, not just termination. But as they walked back toward the administrative levels, Hollis found himself thinking about the child's question. Is something wrong? The assumption in her voice that adults would fix problems, that the world was fundamentally a place where people took care of each other. When had he stopped believing that? "Crane," he said, as they reached his office, "I'm going to ask you once more. Do you have anything to say about these discrepancies in your reports?" Tobias straightened his shoulders. "I was disposing of damaged goods, according to my best judgment." "Odd. If that judgment was flawed, I accept responsibility." It was almost the right answer. Not quite an admission of guilt, but close enough that Hollis could interpret it however he needed to. He could write a report about procedural improvements and additional training. He could recommend tighter inventory controls without mentioning specific violations. Or he could follow regulations exactly and destroy. A man whose only crime was trying to keep children from starving. Hollis sat behind his desk and pulled a blank incident report on his terminal. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment. "Mr. Crane," he said finally, "I'm going to recommend that you receive additional training on proper disposal procedures. I'm also going to authorize an increase in the emergency assistance budget for lower-level residents." Tobias blinked, clearly not certain he'd heard correctly. "Sir, apparently we've had some communication failures about which supplies are available for emergency distribution. I'll make sure those policies are clarified." Hollis turned his screen so Tobias could see it. Instead of an incident report, he was filling out a budget allocation request. "Will 5,000 credits monthly be sufficient to address the disposal issues you've been handling?" For the first time since entering the office, Tobias smiled. "That should cover it, sir. Good. And Crane? Next time you want to help hungry children, fill out the proper paperwork first." That evening, as Hollis reviewed his daily reports, he found himself thinking about Mika's assumption that adults would fix problems. Maybe, he thought, She wasn't wrong. Maybe they just needed to remember how. 6 months later, the morning shift change at Kepler Station looked different to those who knew where to look. The same atmospheric processors hummed their constant rhythm. Same transport ships arrived with supplies and departed with processed ore, but something fundamental had shifted in the spaces between official procedures and corporate mandates. Nira Vex stood at the depot window, but this time she wasn't trading away pieces of her past. She wore the blue jacket of a station employee, and the tablet in her hands contained inventory reports rather than desperate calculations of how long their credits might last. "Morning, Tobias," she said as he approached with a steaming cup of actual coffee, one of the small luxuries that came with his promotion to senior supply coordinator. "Morning, Nira. How's the new emergency assistance program running?" She pulled up the weekly statistics on her tablet. 43 families receiving regular support. 12 people placed in temporary work programs. 5 children enrolled in the education center. She paused, allowing herself a small smile. 0 reports of malnutrition in the lower levels. It had taken months to build the framework that made those numbers possible. Hollis had proven surprisingly resourceful at finding budget categories that could be stretched to cover enhanced waste management protocols and expanded emergency preparedness measures. Tobias had trained Nira to help coordinate distribution, teaching her to read the subtle signs of families in crisis before they reached the breaking point. But the real breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. "Mama, look what we made." Mika burst through the depot doors, her arms full of what appeared to be a scale model of the station's lower levels. Behind her followed a group of children ranging in age from 6 to 15, all carrying similar projects. "Very impressive," Nira said, admiring the detailed construction. "What's this for?" "Ms. Rivera says we're going to present it to the Station Council," announced a boy whose family had arrived on the same transport that had brought the Vexes to Kepler. "We're showing them how to make the lower levels better for families." The education center had been another surprise. When word spread about the emergency assistance program, Dr. Elena Rivera had approached Hollis about starting classes for the children of transient workers. She'd argued that educated children would grow up to be more productive station residents, which was true enough that the consortium had approved a small budget for the program. What she hadn't mentioned in her proposal was that she would be teaching the children to think like urban planners, engineers, and social workers. "And what improvements are you suggesting?" Tobias asked, genuinely curious. Mika launched into an explanation of insulation upgrades, communal heating systems, and designated play areas that would make the lower levels safer and more comfortable for families. Her presentation was sophisticated enough that any corporate executive would take it seriously, but delivered with the enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who believed adults would listen to good ideas, regardless of where they came from. Watching her daughter speak confidently about load-bearing structures and thermal efficiency, Nira felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but this time it was pride rather than fear. Mika had grown 3 inches since their arrival at Kepler Station. Her cheeks had filled out. Her eyes had lost that hollow look of chronic hunger. And she'd developed the kind of unsinkable optimism that came from living in a world where problems had solutions. "The council meeting is next week," Tobias said. "Think they'll listen?" "Hollis will make them listen," Nira replied. "And if they don't, Dr. Rivera will probably have the children stage a protest." It was a joke, but not entirely. The past 6 months had revealed unexpected depths to many of the station's residents. People who had seemed content to follow regulations and avoid complications had quietly begun finding ways to make those regulations work for everyone rather than just the comfortable few. The woman with twins, whose name turned out to be Zara Chun, had started an informal childcare network that allowed single parents to take shifts in the better-paying dock jobs. The elderly Centauri man from the storm shelter had begun teaching technical skills to young people who couldn't afford formal education. Even Security Chief Ramos had started organizing self-defense classes for residents of the lower levels, claiming it was part of community safety initiatives. "You know what I think?" Mika said, looking up from her model, with the serious expression she wore when working through complex ideas. "I think people always wanted to help each other, just needed someone to show them it was okay." Nira exchanged glances with Tobias. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought. Is that your theory about human nature, little star? Nira asked. Not just human nature, Mika corrected. All people nature. Centauri people, Zephorian people, everyone people. We're supposed to take care of each other. That afternoon, as Nira finished her shift and prepared to walk home, now being a small but real apartment in the station's residential section rather than a hiding place in the maintenance corridors, she found herself thinking about her daughter's words. The universe was still vast and often cruel. The mining consortium still prioritized profits over people. Kepler Station was still a hard-scrabble outpost where survival required constant vigilance and occasional impossible choices. But within those constraints, small community had discovered something that corporate policies and administrative regulations couldn't quite account for. It's a stubborn human tendency to care for each other's children, to share warmth during storms, and to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. When Mika ran ahead to show their neighbors her model of improved housing designs, Nira felt the weight of the jade pendant she'd bought back the previous month, gift from the community fund that had grown out of Tobias's initial waste management project. The pendant hung warm against her chest, carrying the familiar comfort of family heritage, but it no longer felt like the only thing standing between them and starvation. Some things, she reflected, were more valuable than others. But sometimes, if you were very lucky and found the right people, you didn't have to choose between them. As the station's lights dimmed toward evening cycle, families gathered for shared meals. Children played in corridors that no longer felt dangerous, and Kepler Station hummed with something more than just atmospheric processors. It hummed with the sound of people building home,